Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on the uses and challenges of AI in global health. On behalf of everyone at RSTMH and DNDi, I'm here to welcome you. So for those of you I don't know, I'm Tamar Ghosh. I'm Chief Exec at the RSTMH and so pleased to be at this day for this webinar. So excited for the next 90 minutes. For those of you that don't know RSTMH, just a couple of minutes, we are a society and membership organisation for those working in or interested in global health and tropical medicine. Now, we've been going for a very long time, and over those decades, the scope of our work has really enlarged. We are looking at infectious diseases. We are interested also in neglected tropical diseases and non-communicable diseases, but we also are interested in the context behind the hindrance to our solving the problems of equity and access to health. So that includes things like conflict, like climate change, like stigma. Sometimes there are also those contextual pieces which might help us along the journey to equity and eradication of disease. And one of those such things is AI. So we're really pleased to be here and partnering with DNDi for this webinar. Last year at our annual meeting, we had a panel discussion about AI with many of the speakers you'll see today. And it was a fascinating discussion, and we've had so much interest. We wanted to try and put on a bit more time for that discussion. So here we are. And I just wanted to mention before we move on that we are opening a call for papers in our two scientific journals with a deadline of the 19th of July. And that's for anything that you feel is important to share in the topic of AI and global health. It could be research, it could be a commentary, it could be case study. But do think about, as we go through the webinar today, any learnings or research you would like to share with a wider scientific audience through that call and the special collection on AI and global health. Okay, so it's a bit of housekeeping. We've got 90 minutes. For questions during today's webinar, please do post them in the Q&A, which should be at the bottom of your screen. The chat is disabled, so Q&A for all questions. We are recording, as you would have noticed when you joined. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the chair for the webinar, and that's Dr. Craig Tipple, who is Medical Director at DNDi, and he's going to take you through the further introductions, and I'll be back at the very end. So sit back and enjoy the webinar. Thank you, and over to Craig.
Tamar, thanks so much. Real pleasure to be here, real pleasure to build on the collaboration between RSTMH and DNDi. For those of you who don't know, DNDi is a non-profit research and development organisation which develops medicines for neglected diseases, predominantly neglected tropical diseases, wherever there might be need in a partnership model. We have a great panel lined up today for a really robust discussion, I think, about this topic. But to get us started, to set the scene today, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Charles Mowbray, Charlie, as we know him here at DNDi. Charlie is our discovery director. He's a medicinal chemist by training, and he leads our discovery group here at DNDi. That involves everything from first identifying chemicals that could be medicines, and then putting them through their paces in stages that we call screening and hit to lead, and lead optimization before then generating animal data, which then gives us an idea that they're going to be working in people. Charlie's been leading a work stream in DNDi looking at how we can apply artificial intelligence to medicine discovery and development. And I'm very, very pleased, Charlie, to welcome you now to talk us through some key topics in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, and thanks, Tamar. Let me just put my slides up. Hopefully you see those okay now. Great. So really great to have an opportunity to dive into this topic again, and really a bit of a teaser for what will follow in the discussion, I hope. And I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence and global health. If they'll allow me to move my slides. There we go. So as Craig said, at DNDi, we have a broad interest in infectious diseases, particularly those that affect patients neglected by the conventional pharmaceutical development system because of the lack of commercial incentive. So many horrible, life-threatening, debilitating diseases here with many different challenges. And we really try to apply the most appropriate, best modern science to try and the challenges of developing and making accessible new treatments for these diseases. And that includes trying to embrace AI and use that to help us. So as Craig said, I'm a scientist, I'm a medicinal chemist, and I tend to view the world through that lens. So I'll give you some examples that probably come more from my area of expertise, but I think we've got a very diverse panel who can help to explore the broader topic and the context beyond drug discovery into clinical trials, into public health and health service delivery, and some of the issues that come with that as well. As you can see, just dropped in a copy of our portfolio here. It gives you an indication of the range of projects that we have with different infectious diseases and at different stages of the value chain, if you like, from those early ideas all the way through the development through to access, manufacturing, and all of the downstream activities. And we really think there are opportunities for AI all across here. So perhaps to introduce the topic and help us start to explore some of the topics, I had a few questions which I thought it would be interesting to address. AI is all around us, but what's it got to do with global health? What does the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning actually look like, with some real examples? Is this going to replace me and Craig and other people working in R&D, or is it a complement to our existing approaches? What's AI being used for in global health? And what do we think AI could bring to global health in the next 5 years? So lots of hype, lots of hope, but what do we think will actually change, and what should we look out for? And as I mentioned, there are a number of challenges. We can't just jump in and start using AI tools and solving all our problems. There's a lot of steps that we need to go through and a lot of challenges to make that possible. So AI is all around us. It's in the devices that we hold in our hands, in our mobile phones, when we go shopping, if we Amazon, if we have a Alexa in the house, that sort of thing. It's all AI driven. But it's also there in lots of different scientific applications. And there's a paper here that I picked out that highlights some of the areas that AI is being used for, from weather forecasting, designing factories, but obviously in health, in medicine, and all sorts of opportunities, but also AI or artificial intelligence and machine learning is an umbrella. It's a banner term that's used to describe many things to many people. And this paper helps to dig in a little bit deeper. I should show my cards. I'm not an AI expert. I'm an enthusiast to try and use AI to help us do our work better. So when I hear about active learning, generative models, deep learning, self-supervised learning, I can't give you all of the expert explanation of how that works, but I'm beginning to understand some of the differences. There are many different sorts of AI, many sorts of machine learning that could be applied to help us here. So let's keep a broad focus to start. As mentioned, again, there's a lot of discussion about whether the machines are going to replace us, whether artificial intelligence, machine learning can simply do away with drug discovery and the years it takes and just give us the new drugs. Well, I don't think that's the case. What I hope and I think might be possible is that new tools will allow us to do our work more efficiently, maybe go a bit faster, and allow us as scientists, as clinicians, to focus our efforts on the piece where we really add most value and do the things that computers can't do, and allow the computers to do the things that maybe we find difficult or slow or have a lot of repetition involved, things that computers are very good at. So really, I see in the projects that we're running today, some advances are happening on the interface where people and scientists are supported by computers and AI tools that allow them to move more quickly and to do things that weren't previously possible. So I think that new partnership, a new member on the team having an AI isn't something to be frightened of, it's something to embrace and recognise as an opportunity to try and do things better. it's, again, if you look in the news, you'll see that many other people share this view. So in the pharmaceutical industry, where more typically for commercial interests, but hence with a lot of resources to dip into, there are huge efforts to try and bring artificial intelligence tools forward. And a review last year highlighted more than 800 biotechs and pharmatech companies based on AI and AI platforms trying to do just this, either for themselves or developing tools and services to sell to others or to make available to others to advance their work. And in the middle there's a few companies, I would say some leading examples of pharmaceutical companies, pharmatech companies that are really using integrated AI platforms where they're really applying AI machine learning across their work, really trying to design their workflows and to exploit the capabilities of AI. So Benevolent, In Silico, Exscientia, you may well have heard of. And they're not alone. So the big pharma companies are really heavily invested here. And again, you can see an analysis of some of the many multi-million-dollar deals that have been struck by pharma companies with these pioneers and entrepreneurs that are bringing new tools forward, and they're also developing their own tools and applying them in-house. And you only have to pick up the scientific literature or go to a meeting today to hear lots of excitement about how this is being used and how it might really transform the way that new medicines are discovered and developed. So what is it that these tools can do for us? And again, I'll start from my area of expertise at discovery end. So if we think about discovering drugs as needing to understand the biology of an infection and understanding at a molecular level the role of proteins and other biomolecules and the interaction of drugs or monoclonal antibodies or any other kind of intervention with them and how that impacts the disease and the patient. Selection of targets is something that artificial intelligence can help us with. Finding molecules or different ways of intervening with those targets, screening, again, can be done in high throughput mode, in virtual mode, so computers can screen vast libraries of compounds to find starting points for projects. They can also predict the properties of those molecules, including potential biological activity against that target, even before the experiment's conducted. So as a way to prioritize what you make and test, there's some pretty powerful and interesting tools here, and to speed up that cycle of designing, making, testing, and analyzing the results, and predicting other important features like the safety, ultimate safety of the molecules that are being tested and advanced. And there's some reviews here that really dig into this deeper and highlight some of the new tools, and there are many different opportunities and parallel approaches. So I'm excited as a drug discovery scientist, but it's not exclusively in my domain. As I mentioned, the same holds true in clinical trials. And there's a nice paper here that really looks at some of the opportunities about designing clinical trials. So trying to come up with a better protocol, trying to more quickly get to the information that's wanted with the minimum number of patients. How do you recruit those patients? How do you do that most efficiently, avoiding dropout, accelerating the recruitment once the study starts, all sorts of things here which are possible, as well as important oversight of the conduct of the study, looking at data as it emerges in real time, helping the human team to identify signals early and to respond to those, and doing some things that AI is especially good at. For example, if we're looking at photographs of lesions for an infected skin disease, for example, computers are extremely good at categorizing images, and machine learning processes can really help to accelerate diagnosis and also monitoring response to treatment. So important opportunities here. And then when the studies are finished, analysing the results and more quickly coming up with some conclusions and helping the team to understand what they've achieved with this data, and really summarising that and producing reports. Again, powerful tools really hard to help us here. I take an opportunity just to talk about 2 or 3 examples of how at DNDi we're actually using AI in some different ways that illustrate some of these points. The first of these we call parasite painting. So we're screening, we're testing potential drug candidates for their ability to kill parasites that cause infectious diseases. Often these are intracellular parasites. So, for example, Schnagger's disease, Trypanosoma cruzi, these inside human host cells. In a cell culture, we can have a look at the effect of drug added to that culture. Does it kill the parasite? Does it kill the host cell? Obviously, we want something that's selective. And if we add dyes and stain the parasite and the cell and capture many images at high resolution, we can start to see over time the effect of the drug on both parasite and the host cell, but also we can start to observe the morphological changes in those two parasite and host, and start to determine how is it that the drug is having its effect. So giving us an information about the phenotype and connecting that back to the basic biology. So very powerful and exciting new way of speeding up our learning and screening process. At DNDi, we're involved in some drug discovery projects for broad spectrum antivirals for pandemic preparedness. Here we have a lot of knowledge about viral genomes, and we can rapidly turn that into potential targets, biological targets that could be addressed with small molecule drug discovery programs, and using artificial intelligence tools to help us select and prioritize those targets, but then to design molecules, so speeding up the design process, helping us to work out how to make those molecules. So AI can help us to identify the best synthetic route for making a drug candidate, and a number of other aspects are part of this artificial intelligence enabled drug discovery platform. And the last one I find particularly exciting, we've been working on dengue for a few years now, and in addition to looking for antiviral drugs to treat patients infected with the dengue virus, we're trying hard to find drugs that could work through the host to limit the effect of the infection. As we know, for some viral infections, it's not just the presence of the virus, but it's the host response, and ultimately the tissue damage and the pathology that's caused by the infection that leads to the serious symptoms of disease. And we'd like to block this. And using partnership with Benevolent AI, a UK-based AI company, and their large language models and the knowledge tree they have that's been trained on human biology and the development of drugs for other non-infectious diseases, but also knowledge about processes involved in those diseases and how they bear similarity to dengue. We've been able to identify some drug pathways and drugs that engage those, which we think could be useful in treating dengue. And we're looking forward to sharing more information about the promising results from that soon. So, I've said we think AI can contribute across the value chain. Some of the things that I've already talked about, and at DNDi we're now engaging more in applying these tools, and there's a list of activities where we're trying to bring these tools to bear on our work and to run some pilots and introduce new partnerships with some of these innovative companies and academics with new AI tools and ideas to help us to do our work better, and to experiment and see whether those new tools really do help. As I say, I think it's important to keep an open mind on this, because there's a lot of hype, a lot of hope. And as I've said, I think AI could help us to go faster, cheaper, make better decisions earlier, reduce attrition. But I think at the moment there's still a dearth of head-to-head examples that really allow us to say this method works and it makes a difference and it saves this much time. Because we're adding new tools, they're not necessarily for free. They come with a cost and challenges, a carbon footprint, challenges around sharing data, etc. So before we do that, we really need to make sure that these new methods are working. And although, for example, there are more than 25 drugs in clinical development today that were discovered using AI platforms, we don't actually know whether they're going to be successful or whether that will be a better process than discovering them by conventional means. So it's important that people are open and share the results of their experiments using these new tools. think there's quite a few challenges to applying these new methods, and I think we'll talk about this some more in the panel. But is there a data available, especially for neglected diseases and neglected populations? Do the data sets exist to allow us to use these new tools? Are the data sets representative of the patients that we want to help? Actually, is the data gathered from a different region or a different set of people that maybe don't represent the patients of interest? So it's really important to make sure that we're looking at the right data and we have enough data. Are the algorithms that we're using available? Are they explainable? Can we understand and explain to regulators and patients how we've reached the conclusions that we have? This is important too. And I think we're trying to use new tools that have been developed perhaps in other areas, and we're trying to apply them in global health, public health, neglected diseases. We need to make sure we have the right skill set, the right experts to help us, and access to the right tool. So I think this data availability, the ethics around how we do this, and the skills we have to do this. I hope that's on the topic up a little bit. I think AI can use the data in global health to accelerate progress. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different sorts of opportunities here, and I think these can, if they're used in the right way, augment what human scientists and clinicians are doing. Potentially, across almost everything we do, there's an opportunity for AI, but I think we need to look very carefully at what would be the most impactful ways and make sure that we're running controlled experiments to make sure we're not just doing something because we can, we're doing it because it's useful. I think this is very dynamic. Even since we spoke last summer on this topic, the amount of new developments and new tools that have come forward is staggering. So it's highly dynamic, and we have to keep our eyes open to that. And we'll continue to need to address some of the issues, especially in our space with neglected diseases, about the lack of data, the access to the tools, and lack of investment to really exploit these to their full benefit. I think that's where I finish, and I hand back to Craig.
Charlie, thank you so much for that great sort of, I call it a whistle-stop tour through potential for AIs and how to leverage it in drug discovery. But I think also actually framing up very nicely at the end there some of the broader sort of issues that we're going to have to be tackling with from a global health perspective. I'm very, very pleased today to have a great panel to help now sort of unpack some of these issues. We have Carleigh Krubiner, who joins us from the Wellcome Trust, where she leads bioethics, and I think helps Wellcome Trust to embed consideration of ethical, social, cultural dimensions to how the organisation supports science and improves health. We have Gita Moghaddam, who's a science-based entrepreneur, currently is a UK Research and Innovation Scholar at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Clinical Neuroscience. Eva's going to put a more full bio for all the participants in the chat, I should say. We are also very lucky to be joined by Rohit Malpani. So Rohit is the former policy director at the MSF Access Campaign and now an independent consultant with significant, I should say, legal background and the policy background and a particular interest in artificial intelligence, antimicrobial resistance, and medicines access. So this is our panel for this afternoon, and they've all got their video on so we can see them looking back at us here. Panel, to get going, Charlie sort of said something interesting, which was there's an awful lot of hype when it comes to AI at the moment. But I think also what we saw in his presentation was that there's enormous power and potential benefit here. So sort of maybe as a quick opener to each of you, could I ask for a reflection on sort of maybe one or other of those? What do you think is sort of one of the really important opportunities that we have for innovation here? Or conversely, what do you think is sort of particularly overhyped? And if you're feeling particularly vocal, you could probably give me one of each. Carleigh, should we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So I think, Charlie touched on a lot of the really exciting bits of where AI tools can use that computational power in drug discovery using large data sets. But I really do take that point around the overhyped potential. I think particularly right now we're at peak hype for generative AI, for large language models, especially since ChatGPT-4 hit, the open market and people are really excited about it. So I feel like we've been seeing a little bit of a, when you have a hammer, everything's a nail phenomenon. It sort of seems like it's being applied to everything, even when it may not be useful or appropriate. So I think one of the things that we're looking at when we're seeing applications come through or new projects and assessing that is, what's the unique value proposition of the AI being applied in this particular instance? Again, is it complementary? Is it trying to replace or task shift things that humans probably should be doing? How was the AI developed, and is it appropriate to the context of the populations to which it's being applied? So I think there's a lot of big questions about, is this even the right application? Is there something that is more cost effective or appropriate or sustainable? I mean, I heard about something that was essentially trying to promote hand washing in a rural village, and they had this really over technological solution when we know that there's very cheap and effective behavioral insights approaches that can promote hand washing. So I think that's really my pause where I'm sort of seeing it everywhere, applied to everything, and I'm hoping that we'll sort of see a course correction once the newfangled thing, the shiny new tool, dies down, and really focusing on these things that would otherwise be impossible for us to do as humans, and add that complementarity of analyzing huge data sets. Though again, there are still challenges with those, with bias, with the accessibility of the data, and all of those things that Charlie touched on. But yeah, I'm hoping we'll see a course correction soon to where there's really that unique value of the AI being applied, rather than just sort of oh, we've got this new thing, let's just throw it into the mix because we can.
Yeah, I love that. I think we're going to dig into a couple of those issues that you've raised in a bit more detail as we go through this discussion. But I really love the analogy of sort of AI being a hammer and everybody's looking for the nail to hit with it at the present time. Rohit, how about you? What do you think's hyped, or what do you think is the most exciting piece here?
Yeah, I think I would second actually what Carleigh said, which is around generative AI. I think it's an example of where you tend to see more focus on what's gaining capital and investment, and not necessarily what's going to prove impact. And we've seen that, over the last few months with the amount of money that's gone into developing additional language models. But what we do know is that there's a lot of risks associated. So we know about the error rates, or the rates of hallucination. We know that these models have significant carbon and water footprints, which have then other sort of health consequences. And there's sort of this broader concern in terms of how language models sort of both create knowledge and then disseminate it, that create real risks to sort of how we think about science is produced and ultimately consumed. So yes, and I think some of the correction actually is that the earlier, so to speak, versions of AI or models and discriminative AI are actually showing much more impact and potential. But I think that those are now sort of being ignored just because of all the rush around generative AI.
Thanks, Rohit. I think that the environmental piece is one that always strikes me, because it's not immediately apparent, right? But obviously the amount of computing power that's needed to run these things is an enormous drain on resource. Gita, how about you? I mean, I know you've been sort of working hard with some AI approaches. What's something that you're really excited about?
I'm quite excited that we are all talking about AI these days. ChatGPT for me was an opportunity that everyone is now interested in AI. To me, this is a good opportunity so that we bring all stakeholders together so that we discuss challenges and concerns. And it created sort of a common language, because everyone can feel they can get something out of that. But implementing AI comes, as other people already mentioned, comes with some challenges. And where I am more focused right now, I'm trying to understand, is there legal and regulatory challenges where we are going to use this big data to generate output? Who's the owner of this data? And the data we are using sometimes are copyrighted. whether we are infringing some legal terms there, and how we're going to share the IP generated from these tools. In terms of regulatory frameworks, some countries are ahead of the others. MHRA recently, they launched their sandbox, which is called AI Airlock, and it's like a collaborative, safe space so that you can test and generate evidence that you need for regulatory bodies. Some countries are slightly behind. When it comes to global health, it becomes a big challenge, because how do you want to share the data when you've got like a fragmented system? But WHO now is doing a good job with ITU and trying to harmonize all these regulatory standards. So to me, the way forward sounds quite promising.
Gita, thanks so much. Again, I think we'll probably come back to you and unpack the piece on intellectual property and maybe Rohit on that topic in a little while. Charlie, I can probably imagine what you think is most exciting here, but or maybe you're going to surprise me.
Well, I think I'm excited about many things here, but I think there's also a lot of things that are unproven. And so from the hype side, I'm approached every week, probably every day, by somebody, smart data scientist, AI guru, who says, I can solve all your problems, which is interesting because I haven't told them what my problems are. So I think, actually, when you start to dig into what we're looking at, which is neglected diseases with limited data, small data sets, the big claims about how they can solve our problems and accelerate them don't stand up, because, the approach of transplanting or transposing the approach that's been used in areas where there are big data sets and doing something differently simply aren't possible. So I think we have to keep a simple amount of caution and actually, what's the proof? Can you show me the examples of how this has been done? So the example I touched on in my talk of our work with Benevolent, why do I think that's worth trying? Well, because there's a good example where it did work. During COVID, Benevolent were able to propose the repurposing of baricitinib, which was one of the drugs that got approved for use in COVID, as a host-directed therapy for an acute viral infection, which makes me think this is something that might be possible for another disease like dengue. So I think listening to what other people are doing, listening to the experience of the experiments that people are trying, and using that to guide our use is going to be important for us. And so I think those short-term demonstrations of success would be really important. Maybe some of the long-term things that could really transform what I do in drug discovery, selection of better targets early and speeding that process up, will work out, but it will still take us years to know for sure whether that was a good thing. So I think we have to gauge our enthusiasm a little bit and not jump into everything with both feet.
Yeah, I think I get a similar number of those emails through, and it is, it's a new shiny thing, right? It's difficult to sort of ignore, but at the same time, we've only got a limited amount of hours in the day to sort of filter these things out and decide where we're really going to generate most impact. Just a reminder for the attendees, after we've had this panel discussion, in about 25 minutes time, there will be the chance for you to get your questions answered by the panel as well. I can see a couple of questions coming into the Q&A, but do type your questions into there. I think some things have already been addressed off very adeptly by Ava. But do pop your questions in, and I'll try and get through as many of those as I can in the panel discussion in about 25 minutes time. So why don't we dig into a couple of these things? I think a number of the key issues have been raised in these opening thoughts, and there's something that both I think Carleigh and Rohit raised. But Carleigh, maybe I'll pop this question to you to start with, and then maybe Rohit can supplement around the potential for bias in the outputs that AI generates. I mean, how cautious do we need to be? How cautious do we need to be when we're thinking about health data? Or is this, again, is there a lot of hype about the fact that AI can hallucinate? Is that the exception, or is it the rule? So how do you think we should be thinking about and tackling the potential for bias?
Yeah, I am very concerned about bias. I mean, we know not just in the outputs, but in the inputs. So just the data that we have that it's being trained on, particularly in the health space, is hugely biased. I mean, most of our data largely is around middle-aged white men. That's not what most of the population looks like. Not to point any fingers at people, but so I think there's that understanding of knowing just how much bias already exists in any number of data sets that we might be drawing on, let alone sort of the ChatGPT that's sort of learning from again, very, very Western and American data sets as well. And then you've got that compounding, reinforcing algorithmic bias that's going to then codify that. And then if we become over-reliant on it, we don't have ways to assess, flag it, correct it, and especially when things are continuously learning, I think it really can go down a very problematic rabbit hole, especially if we're thinking about some of these generative AI applications or task shifting to chatbots for health and things that would be really about replacing humans. So I think it is worth underscoring that we're talking about a lot of different types of tools and applications under the umbrella of AI and ML. Each of which will have different challenges related to bias in both the inputs and the outputs. But I think that we don't yet have the right tools to mitigate those biases. And I think a huge thing that that we need to do is actually just get better data to input from the start and have better open data sources to be able to use the best inputs, that way we can really leverage the technology of what machine learning can offer across the piece. So yeah, that is my concern. And I think it's part of my worry about how quickly people are jumping on the bandwagon for some of these applications when we know that there's this risk, when we've seen really problematic outputs and ways that the algorithms might reinforce exactly the kinds of biases we'd worry about, especially as we're trying to move toward broader DEI, better equity. Yeah, I think it's quite concerning. So I think there's a lot more work to be done, both in terms of the training data and making sure that that's actually high quality and representative and diverse in the ways that it needs to be for the research questions that we have, for the applications that we're intending to use these on. But also, I've heard things about fairness metrics, and quite frankly, I feel like it's not the right approach because it's trying to then correct for something in really perverse ways, at least from what I've seen. That doesn't get at the core heart of the problem, that we're just missing data that is representative of the people that need it most, and is not going to address the heart of the issue.
Yeah, Carleigh, thank you so much. I mean, I think, the absence of data in certain populations is clearly a critical concern here, right? I mean, there's something, at DNDi, we always try and make sure that our trial data from the populations that we study are open access and available. Whether or not they're already flowing into sort of, AI use, I do not know. I mean, certainly we have plans to be able to use those internally, but yeah, of course you're right. The vast majority of data that these tools are pulling on is not representative of the global population as a whole. Rohit, do you have anything to sort of add here?
Yeah, I don't want to add too much on data. I mean, one thing to say is, we saw pretty poor standards of transparency, and that's ultimately going to be important in terms of being able to assess whether or not the data itself is biased, and then to provide that sort of downstream actors information, but also to flag up two other forms of bias. So, most of the people that are involved in developing AI also tend to be mostly white males and mostly from certain countries, meaning that even if, they may not even be looking for these types of bias to be in the data, or even in terms of how an algorithm's designed, and then also in terms of where an algorithm's ultimately tested. So it may not be tested for a lot of different settings in which it could ultimately be used. And so forms of contextual bias ultimately emerge that then also exacerbate some of these other forms of bias we're talking about.
Gosh, yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I guess the work that you do is influenced by your lived experience, right? And consciously or unconsciously. And I think a lot of organizations are working hard to tackle those sorts of unconscious biases, but it's...
Yeah, I mean, so if you take, for example, but it doesn't have to be, it could be just, for example, a lot of AI technology is being developed for older persons.
Yeah.
Just even to participate in thinking through what the design of the technology should look like, and ultimately what would be useful or not useful. So, it's again, even these things on the margins that we're not taking into account.
gosh, it's really quite complex, isn't it? So one of the other things I think I heard sort of in the opening thoughts, and Gita, you started to touch on this, was sort of a concern around regulation, right? I mean, it's in the press a lot. You know, is regulation keeping pace? You know, are we going to end up with, you know, killer robots running loose around the world? You know, sort of that's the kind of tabloid, I guess, headline that we would see here. But then obviously, you know, on a slightly more serious side, you know, there are big sort of international meetings coming together now with international organizations and national sort of departments looking at sort of how we might put some regulation in place. I mean, Gita, from your perspective, I mean, what do you see as the key regulatory issues at the present time? Do you think they're being tackled? And I noticed there was a question in the chat about this as well. So it's obviously something of interest to the audience.
That's a really good question. Regulatory frameworks, they are emerging and evolving fast. So we could say that they are slightly behind the technology, but they are catching up. In the UK, I believe MHRA is doing a really good job. They are creating this ecosystem so that people can talk and they develop solutions together. FDA likewise is doing a great job. They're supporting innovators and they're open, they're approachable so that people can reach them and say, this is what we want to do. What sort of evidence do you think we need to generate to show the safety of our tools? At the same time, innovators are getting more practical in terms of when they're selling the AI tools, they're more realistic, what it can do, what it can also. They're verbalizing the limitations of AI so that we know where we can, instead AI is just a complementary tool that is not going to be in charge of making decisions. Where I see that regulatory bodies are probably put more focus on in the future is where we are making critical clinical decisions without human oversight. That's probably where we're going to apply some limitations. Other area where we will be very strong focus, probably cybersecurity and privacy, to ensure that people know how their data is going to be used in aggregated database to train AI. That becomes, again, very important when we are going across different cultures and different settings across the world. That's why it's important that we keep these dialogues open and people raise their concerns and we can work on solutions together. The other thing which comes to my mind is that lots of different countries are now focused on developing their own databases so that they have the biobank, they have the data that can be fed, and they are good representative of their population. And what I'm seeing right now, pharma is really supporting these local initiatives. And to me, that would be a very good way of at least address one of the biases that Claire and Rohit mentioned.
Gita, thanks so much. There's a lot happening, isn't there? But I don't really get the sense that it's being pulled together. I don't know. Rohit, what do you think? I mean, from your interactions with WHO and maybe more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The WHO has put out at least an initial guidance that sort of brought together regulators from 80 countries to be able to sort of set out some basic considerations that should be thought about across different countries. There is a concern, of course, that we're going to have standards being written mostly by the United States and the European Union, and then expecting other countries to sort of have to apply those standards, even though they may not be fully relevant. There's also other concerns if we're just looking narrowly at the pharmaceutical space that, as you note, there's regulatory divergence. So if every country comes up with a different standard, that both becomes difficult for regulators who often rely on each other as well as for developers. There's concerns over, again, the explainability and transparency of information as to whether or not regulators can make adequate decisions, as we were just talking about with data quality and bias, as to whether or not the algorithms themselves are producing information that can be applied across entire populations. Yeah, so these are just some of the examples of issues. And then also how regulators work with other agencies in their own government. So, for example, with data protection authorities that also have to look at some of these issues and may have to make decisions that correlate with the decisions that regulatory agencies have to make. So we end up having not only a sort of divergent regulatory environment between countries, but also within countries.
Mm. And maybe I can ask Charlie and Carleigh as well. Like from Charlie from our organization's perspective, Carleigh from Wellcome's perspective. I mean, do you see this as a risk that there isn't this sort of framework in place at the moment? Do you see it, or do you see it as sort of actually giving a bit of freedom for people to sort of innovate? Sorry to put you on the spot with that one.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important question. And actually, as we're trying to put in place new partnerships and collaborations and making sure there's a solid legal framework in place for those, it really puts some new challenges in front of us. It's not just about ownership of data. Where did it came from? Do you have consent to use it? But if you're working with different organizations that are then applying AI to that data and not just producing results, but maybe improving their model and using the model for something else, is everybody happy with that? And so there's some new complexities to having the framework for running our projects. I think the explosion of offerings of AI and teams working on AI around the globe makes it much more diverse than it used to be. And in terms of the framework and the regulatory frameworks that come with that, it's not all happening in Europe and the US either. So I think it's good that the innovators are engaging in those discussions and trying to help to develop something practical, because I think if we wait for it to be policed after the event, it'll be very, very difficult, because people are exploring all sorts of things at the moment. So yeah, I think it's a important question, and it's certainly quite dynamic at the moment.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we saw this with data protection more broadly, I think. It's something that I grapple with on a day-to-day basis. First there was GDPR, and then there was UK GDPR after Brexit, and now the Swiss data regulations come in. Every country is developing its own, and they're versions on a theme, but you still have to sort of twist your way through them, and it's making my life very complex actually when it comes to data sharing. I mean, Khalili, what about Wellcome here? I mean, you're a major global health funding organization. Are you keen that sort of research that you sponsor has sort of thought through these issues?
Yeah, I mean, on the regulation
framework, what are you doing?
Yeah, on the regulation side, I mean, I think it's a really welcome development that MHRA and other regulatory bodies are starting to look at least the AI applications in health almost as a medical device, and setting up a framework even for evidentiary standards. I mean, for us, I think this is one of the real challenges is of right now, so much of this has been self-regulated by commercial parties, and we actually don't know what's efficacious. We don't know what's working well. There's a lot of sort of potentially select findings that are not being held to the same evidence standards that we would think about for other types of health interventions. So I think it's really exciting to see the development of a framework for how you'd actually get to a point where you can say, great, this has this evidence standards, these safety concerns have been identified and are being monitored. These are the indications for use in the way that we would for many other types of health interventions. I think the broader challenges around data privacy, accessibility, then also thinking about how we make sure that the training data is representative and diverse and fit for purpose. I mean, those are huge challenges. Again, as you mentioned, I think we all struggle with some of these, even for very simple data transfers, working around some of the GDPR. I think we have to be very careful as those governance structures are developed and evolved to make sure that there's not unnecessary barriers to the things that we actually want to get done that would be really valuable and improved, while also making sure that there are appropriate safeguards for people's private, especially medical related data and personal health information, things that might contribute to fears of hypersurveillance, where people are kind of passively having their data used for all sorts of things that they didn't realize that when they tick that accept cookies or TNA agreement that it might be used for. So I think it is a tricky balance, and I think it's going to require a lot of global coordination to figure out what that looks like. Yeah, and then there's the last bit too around sort of the scientific enterprise around how people are generating hypotheses. And this is where I think we've seen, again, since ChatGPT has become much more widespread in its use, we have an initial policy that's come out really just around transparency and disclosure. So if people are using that in the development of their applications and their proposals, we want to know how. And then if that's part of their proposed methodology for the research, we want to understand how they're applying these tools. But I think it's, on the one hand, there are potentially really exciting benefits of, people who were less successful in applying for Wellcome funding because English is not their first language, that may help them to make a more compelling proposal. There's also a concern that we're going to start to see things that, hypotheses generated through some of these common tools start to look really similar, and it might narrow sort of pool of scientific discovery if we're relying on tools like this, and new generations of scientists are essentially using these tools in ways that reinforce very narrow sets of research questions and approaches and methodologies that are based on probabilistic, well, this is what's been done before. So yeah, there's so many different lenses of how these tools might be applied in scientific and academic enterprise to the future applications in healthcare delivery. All of which require different frameworks and approaches and regulatory mechanisms.
It's going to take some time, isn't it? Rather cynically, I suspect it's going to take a couple of high-profile, let's just say, less than adequate uses in order to really sharpen minds and hearts here. You mentioned something interesting actually there about ChatGPT to write applications. Quick note to self. I saw interestingly actually the New England Journal of Medicine came out and said that they're actually okay with people using ChatGPT to write sort of pieces of articles that are submitted, so long as that content has been, as long as they declare that ChatGPT has been used there. But I think they're sort of, they put themselves out there with that. I'm not sure that's a really a common view. And I suppose actually from Wellcome's perspective, you may not actually know when some things have been written by GPT or by humans. But it does bring us to this question about sort of ownership, right, and intellectual property. But when it comes to AI outputs, I mean, these algorithms are fed by information from the world, and then that information is used, and it can be used for commercial benefit, or it could be used for, for the greater good, or sometimes those two things come together. But so I think I'm going to put this question to a couple of the panel here. I mean, Gita, first of all, sort of, you're an entrepreneur and a scientist. I guess IP is important for you in terms of sort of some of the ownership here. I mean, what are your views on this? Is it a threat to innovation in the sector? Do you think the IP needs to be protected that's generated by AI, or do you have a broader sort of approach to this?
It's a really good question. Me working at the cross sector, this is one of my biggest challenges, and it's not just me, it applies to the wider community sharing the data. So in terms of ownership of the data that as input goes to AI, that's a big challenge. It's a different challenge in terms of copyright and everything else. But the data is generated by AI. Generally, it can't, I mean, the machine itself can't own it. So it's not entitled to have the ownership. If a human uses the data that is generated by AI system and generate new things, then they have the authorship of the new data. But my approach is that changing the culture and come to a conclusion that we all need to share our data and resources to get somewhere with this tool. AI is powerful. It has its own limitations, but it can do a lot. But we can unlock this potential only if we all agree to share our resources. And that's where I believe pushing for this paradigm shift in the culture and accepting that there is a risk. We manage the risk. We can't eliminate the risk. And we share our data, resources, and we create the impact, especially in global health, where AI can be transformative, and let it go. That would be my ideal case and my approach towards this challenge right now.
So it's more of a public good. Rohit, you have a history, a professional history as being an IP attorney, as I understand it, in Palo Alto, of all places. So I suspect you've got some views on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. There's a lot of the focus has been on the outputs. Who owns the outputs, or what are the implications in terms of inventorship? But I think what worries me more is about the inputs, and I think three types of inputs in particular. So the first is, especially with the rise of generative AI, but in general, we've now come to this period in which we have a series of foundation models on which other applications and algorithms are being built. And these foundation models, because they require a significant amount of compute capacity and financial resources and expertise, there's very few companies essentially that have the capacity to build them. And so that automatically creates a concentration in the sector in terms of who controls these foundation models and what can be done with them. And sort of some of the praise for Facebook, for example, for creating open source models is a bit false, because they're not really releasing all of the information that's required to make it truly open source. The second concern is around data. So yes, there is an interest in getting people to be sort of more, let's say, contributory towards public health benefits from their data. But there's also a concern that most of these data sets are now being controlled actually by very few, if we look in the pharmaceutical sector, by a few pharmaceutical companies that are only sharing it with each other. And that means that all of the potential public health benefits that we could get from screening and using these data sets are not going to be realized. And you can recognize this from 30 years ago with compound libraries. And it's taken a very long time to be able to get to the point in which you can even screen them in order to identify other uses. And then the third is around algorithms. And the Wellcome Trust actually came out with a very good report, I think it was last year, in which they were surveying a lot of people working in the pharmaceutical sector. And they said the number one concern for them was the aggressive patenting of algorithms. And that ultimately makes them proprietary and means that others cannot use them. So I think this combination of concerns means that even if we do find very good public health benefits of AI, as we've had with other technologies, the actual scope of uses and who can use them or decide how they're going to be used is going to be highly limited.
Thanks so much for that. Charlie, in practical terms, I mean, we've got some collaborations at DNDi with AI-focused organisations. I mean, what's the approach been to IP in the contracts that you've seen coming through? I mean, no specifics, but just broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think what Gita's comments were music to my ears. So we try to practice open science sharing. We think that's the way science happens best and fastest. I think COVID reinforced that for us, the sharing of gene sequences and virus sequences, really around the world allows things to go faster, and then sharing results early allows people to build on those and help solve problems. So, open, collaborative, especially in an area of neglect where there's limited resources. The last thing we need is to have the data locked away in different departments and not to be sharing it and maximising the use of that as well. So I think we're always relatively pragmatic in our approach with DNDi. We're trying to attract help. We're trying to find partners to work on our projects, and we're trying to do it in a way that helps patients. Sometimes it can all be done completely openly. So I think it was quite interesting when Google DeepMind produced AlphaFold 2. This is a remarkable program for predicting the three-dimensional structures of proteins. Published the results for all human proteins and pathogen proteins and shared the source code. So that's really great. It's a great tool. It's very democratizing. AlphaFold 3 has just come out. I think there's some controversy at the moment because I don't think the source code for that's been made available. So, you can't win all the time. Is it good that we've got AlphaFold? Great. Will the subsequent forms of that and the application be as open? I don't know. But I think these are important questions. And I think if I can get access to those tools, whether it's fully open or whether it's people that are willing to help and then will apply those tools to the projects that we're working on in neglected diseases and global health, that's good. I'm happy. Obviously, the more open we can do this and the more widely we can make these tools available, the more chance there is for them to impact on other diseases and for other teams as well. So I think we have to be pragmatic. We know that a lot of the development of new tools is driven by commercial interests, and it's not all being done for public good with public money. So we somehow have to navigate through that.
Charlie, thanks so much. I think some really sort of tangible examples there of the power, I guess, of open access to use of these tools.
if I might, Craig, actually, just to expand on the AlphaFold piece,
Yeah,
the reason they were able to build that algorithm is because there was so much data that had been freely shared. The database of protein crystal structures that researchers have been building over the years was the source of the data that AlphaFold, RosettaFold, and other people developing those algorithms were using. So they're building on an open data source. So I think somehow it would be nice to see some commitment from people that are benefiting from open data if they're producing some new tools to maybe think about how to make that as widely available as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I gave another couple of pounds recently to Wikipedia. Because I just sort of I thought to myself, well, gosh, I use this all the time, and actually maybe this is something that I want to support. It makes me wonder whether a model like that might be useful for these sorts of tools in the future. But let's finally, I think, I call this actually I should say, for the attendees, you have here a funder, an entrepreneur, a lawyer, an advocate, and policy expert, and a drug developer or two, and it's really a great opportunity to ask questions that you have. So do pop those in the chat. But Rohit, you've done some thinking about how the pharmaceutical sector is interacting with AI and sort of what that means, both in terms of challenge and benefit. And you've alluded to a couple of those points. I mean, do you think broadly they're getting it right, or do you think that there's going to have to be advocacy on this point?
I mean, in some ways, it's maybe too early to tell. I do think the early example that Carleigh has mentioned with DeepMind is a good one, and it's a reason for hope in terms of making the algorithm widely available and allowing others to use it and to be able to find potential targets and also to be able to understand the structure of different proteins. I think the benefit, and Carleigh's already laid this all out in his presentation, is it's so flexible, right? So we're going to continue to find different use cases, and probably every drug or vaccine that's going to be developed will have been touched by AI at some point. And there's also the potential, for example, with the the growth of synthetic data, that perhaps clinical trials over time could become more inclusive. And you can also imagine the WHO's looked at some potential post-approval uses of AI, whether in manufacturing or for pharmacovigilance or for supply chain management. The concerns, of course, still are there, and there's a few reasons for that. The first is just most of the investment, again, that's gone into the pharmaceutical side has come from the commercial sector, and that's not per se bad, but it does have certain consequences. The first is that a lot of the talk or the hype perhaps around AI in the pharmaceutical sector is around personalization. So kind of the opposite of what Carleigh's talking about. And personalization sounds very good in a soundbite. It also means that potentially what is being produced is much more exclusionary and only for those who can actually pay for it. There's a concern that AI could be used to help optimize clinical trials or distribution. It could also just as easily be used for surveillance in order to ensure there's not as much sort of dropping out of clinical trials. And there's a concern that instead of AI being used to improve the quality of the trials, it ultimately is going to just lead to being to a faster regulatory approval. So not necessarily developing drugs for all their indications or populations that are needed, but just to accelerate development so that you could get to the market quicker. There's also other risks that exist out there, but I think those are more sort of standardized with AI in general. So we've already talked about the issues of bias, a little bit on explainability. There's also going to be concerns with responsibility. If a lot of people are contributing to developing an algorithm and using it, and as we know in drug development, things ultimately can go wrong, who do you hold accountable for it? And then finally, we've also talked about some of these governance challenges. So the issue is going to be, many of these issues have predated the emergence of artificial intelligence. I think it just adds a level of complexity, but given some of the potential benefits, the key is going to be to take the time to figure them out.
But maybe more of the same, just maybe be a little bit depressing. Good. We are, I think, entering the sort of piece now where we get to address some questions from the audience. There are 3 questions that have sort of been popped into the chat, and I'm gonna field those now. So the first one was around, well, it was more of a statement, but I'm going to pose it as a question. So, telling us that it's important that whilst we build these models, we put more emphasis on the principles of responsible AI. So maybe for each of the panelists here, you can give me sort of one thing that you think, would be a principle of responsible AI. I'll start off and say that, I think for me, it's acknowledging the source of information that's been used with an AI approach. Well, maybe we can go around and add some other thoughts on that. Rohit, do you want to?
Sure. Just quickly, the WHO developed these 6 principles for the ethical use of AI. So I'll just choose one, which is ultimately protect autonomy. To protect autonomy. So ultimately to ensure that humans remain in control, to ensure privacy and informed consent and other sort of aspects.
Carleigh?
Yeah, I mean, Rohit's already mentioned explicability, but I think that there's really a huge, if we want to realize the potential of AI, to be able to be transparent about the data sources, to be able to explain how the model's been designed and built, what uses it should actually be applied to. To me, that's foundational in terms of both building public trust and realizing the ultimate potential, and also avoiding some of the harmful applications that could arise. So I think for me, I picked that one, but obviously there are frameworks out there for responsible AI, and I think it's really just about specifying how that applies to different use cases.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's taken us so long actually to hear the word trust this afternoon. I think it's absolutely fundamental here. Gita, what would be your pick of your top pick for a principle of responsible AI?
I think I picked up the best one. Trust is the crucial element here, so that we can have like a sharing everything and then having a fairness and transparency. I would go for the area we are actively working on right now is bias and fairness in the data. So I would go for that one.
Thanks very much. Charlie, any thoughts on this?
I think really echoing actually the point Carleigh made, transparency about the data sources that's being used to build the models. That's undoubtedly going to influence the applicability domain. So, if the model has no knowledge of the patient group or the disease that you're working on, you may make some predictions, but how valuable they be. So I think pretty important to be transparent about that. And I highlighted in the introduction, I think for the developers of these tools, or certainly the early adopters, to run some controls. So what did it look like with AI? What does it look like without AI? It could be quite powerful to help us identify where we're really getting some benefit.
Thanks. You surprised me actually. I thought you were going to say that it was going to be sort of open access to the outputs and the tools that are developed, but you focused on input, which I think is really critical. And actually sort of going back to the discussion we had near the start around sort of bias of those inputs as well. I think super critical there. And on that point, there's a question from Thor in the chat around whether we know of any global self-owned and run data resource that could be used to either create or scale up and allow AI use benefiting that setting. I mean, I think that, it's clearly critical, isn't it? I mean, Carleigh, you've told us that, most of the data that's feeding these algorithms, maybe is not representative. And, I personally don't know if a sort of, a resource of that nature. I can certainly say that, all of DNDi's data is available for this kind of activity, although that's in a collaboration with the Infectious Disease Data Observatory that are based in Oxford in the UK. But how about the other panelists? Have you come across any sort of global South owned and run data resources that could be useful in this setting?
I'm aware of the databases that are now under development in South Africa and Brazil, and they're doing a great job.
Thanks, Gita. Actually, you've reminded me that I know that Fiocruz in Brazil have quite a large data repository and have a lot of ambition around data sharing and a nice structure for data from Latin America. Carleigh, have you come across anything that Wellcome supported or I'm using you as like the voice piece of Wellcome. I know you look after a very particular piece of
Yeah,
it.
I mean, again, I think it just depends what type of data we're talking about. So, I mean, there are large infrastructural and data collection activities and data banks that we are supporting and trying to diversify the inputs of around genomics, around even climate and health data. I mean, so mental health data, tied to some of our strategic aims and key health challenge areas that we're working in. So Wellcome has certainly made investments in the data. The question is how that data is then being harnessed for AI applications, and whether or not there are global South-based organizations that are then kind of pulling from those data sources. They may exist. I can't speak to those off the top of my head.
Almost certainly. Charlie, Rohit, any specific thoughts here? No.
I mean, I think we work on neglected diseases. Many of those have disproportionately affect the global South. The biggest national patient data registries for those diseases are going to be found in those regions. So I think, for example, on Chagas disease, where we have a strong interest, the database, the genomic database in Colombia or Bolivia might be a very good resource if we're trying to look more into Chagas rather than going to look at something that the UK has developed or the US has developed.
Yeah, no, indeed, and that's exactly what UKRI are focusing on at the moment around Chagas disease. So the next question is quite practical, actually. It's, I think it's asking us to point towards how to handle this, right? I mean, it's been a key issue that we've discussed today, but in terms of, I'm here, I'm a researcher. What can I follow? What should I what should I be following at the moment in order to make sure I'm doing things right? Because I don't think that anyone really wants to get this wrong, right, and end up with a big issue, any of the issues that we've discussed. But equally, where do they turn to? I mean, so a couple of things that I personally look at, the SEALM's guidance on ethical conduct of clinical trials from 2016 has got quite a big section in it on secondary use of data. Oh, very suspicious of that one.
Well, no, sorry, continue.
No, fine. And yeah, and then
I mean, it's actually interesting because when you look at both SEALM's and Declaration of Helsinki, and this is maybe a little bit onto the adjacent to what you were saying. So when we think about research right now, research ethics committees actually are facing a significant challenge in terms of starting to receive both research that is either using AI as a tool or as research essentially on an AI technology, and there is no standardized guidance. And so there's a range of concerns that research ethics committees face in terms of the standard operating procedure, in terms of the resources and expertise, in terms of whether or not that research is even being submitted to them in the first place is something that they should or should not be reviewing. And then ultimately in terms of being able to actually foresee a lot of the risks. So when we think about a lot of AI research, essentially the actual use cases may not end up coming up until the end of the research. And when the research ethics committee is actually reviewing the research, a lot of those may not be apparent to them. And also a lot of the ways in which they have to measure risk or be able to measure benefit also has not necessarily been in their toolbox until now. So I think this is a challenge, therefore, then for those who are conducting the research to be sure that they have the right guidance in place, and those who ultimately have to evaluate the research. And so in a way, we have to build sort of the right interventions across the entire value chain from those who are ultimately publishing the research to those who are evaluating it, to those who are regulating it, to those who are designing it. And so, yes, I think that the question that's being asked is exactly the right one. And on the research ethics committee is actually the one that we're working on at the WHO right now, which is actually trying to build new guidance around how both for the WHO's research ethics committee, but also more broadly have to think about this profusion of AI-based research.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, I think that there are existing models when we think about approaches to consent for biobank samples. There are blanket consent models. There are different ways where we can draw on other ways of proactively thinking about secondary data uses. So I don't think that we're starting from scratch. I think it's just important to, again, depending where the data is coming from, what people agree to in terms of how that data has onward uses within sort of the confines of that specific study or broader uses. And again, I think so much data, when we're not talking about sort of the clinical trial data, a lot of it is coming from public sources, from medical records, other things that have different regulations around, or sometimes not any regulations other than a signing of a terms and agreement form in terms of how that data is then used for scientific or other commercial uses. So yeah, I think there's going to need to be further developments and new approaches potentially to consent as we get better open data. The other big challenge I think that we have is sort of timely sharing, even for, clinical trial registries, timely sharing of data, and also disaggregated data that gives you enough insight into, well, whose data is this? What are the characteristics of that patient population? Can it actually be analyzed at sort of a subgroup analysis that wouldn't get you to the individual personal data, but would give you enough intel to understand how representative that sample is and what you can glean from it. So again, it's a really diverse space and different data sources, but yeah, there's certainly some models we can draw on, and then some places where we really need to innovate and think harder about how different types of data might feed into activities that were not initially envisioned in terms of those use cases.
Thanks, Carleigh. I've had a nice report from Wellcome actually based on the survey. I'm not sure it's the same survey that you referenced earlier, Rohit, but sort of certainly asking research sponsors around what barriers are to open access to data at the present time. And DNDi actually have, I think it's under consideration at the BMJ just now, but we've written a piece on our experience here, and I'd be very happy to share that after this discussion with anyone who's attending and wants to know sort of how we're tackling this. And then there was a sort of actually, I think looking at the time, got another sort of about 3 minutes left at this point. So I just want you to bear that in mind, panel, that we have 3 minutes when it comes to this question. But maybe just to sort of close things out in a sentence or two, I'll permit you to. Which application of AI or machine learning do you think is going to have the biggest impact on global health? Let's say over the next 5 years. If you want to extend that to 10, I'll allow that. Who wants to start? Gita.
For me, I assume it would be image processing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, radiologists beware. Charlie.
I think I talked about my favorite though. I think because it has the opportunity to impact quite soon. I think AI-guided drug repurposing, use of large language models and knowledge trees behind that to accelerate fast phase 2 studies is a really exciting space at the moment. There'll be other stuff in the longer term, but I think that's good for now.
Yeah, I'm quite sure. I'm really looking forward to see what's going to come out of those collaborations. Carleigh, you can have more than 2 sentences if you want.
Sure. I mean, I would agree with what the other panelists have already put forward. And then I think particularly in the processing of large sources of data as it applies to genomics and developments in metagenomics, connectomics. I mean, I think there's so many things that were not possible because we just didn't have the computational power to do before. And that's where I'm really excited to see how we can really harness and glean from these data sources that we do have to make some huge leaps forward and accelerate progress.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, Rohit.
I mean, I think I agree with Gita in terms of image processing or diagnosis and anything to alleviate the health worker shortage. We're having a new brain drain from sub-Saharan Africa and Asia to Europe and the United States. And so, yeah, anything that helps to alleviate that is important.
Thank you so much. In the absence of any other questions from the panel, I might just sort of give a couple of thoughts to close, and then I'll hand this back to Taylor to finish off today. I mean, I think we've seen sort of from Charlie at the start here, sort of quite how powerful some of these tools could be, quite how broad the applications could be for AI and machine learning. And I think we heard from the panel at the end there, really what some key opportunities are going to be sort of over the next 5 years, whether that's sort of the better ways of leveraging our data, whether that's better ways of using images, both the recognition of what's in those images and also sort of, I guess, the creation. The drug discovery space, again, being a very important area, which I certainly know the pharmaceutical industry are very interested in, as Charlie told us, and as Rohit's told us in terms of his work at the WHO. We started at the beginning talking about AI being hype, and I think sort of all the panel gave us sort of examples of where there is hype here. Perhaps we're at peak hype. Carleigh told us that she used the analogy of everything being of AI being a hammer and everybody looking for the nails to hit with it. I'm probably as guilty as that as many others. And Charlie's sort of saying that he's being approached every day with sort of companies who are using these tools, trying to sell these tools, or trying to collaborate using these tools, and filtering out, I think, for all of us and all of our organisations, what are important approaches here versus what is the hype is going to be really important going forward. Because there are an enormous amount of positives to be gained here. The conversation is very much open. If these tools are used with sort of open science and sharing in mind, they're going to be enormously powerful. I mean, look at what Charlie's told us about the power of AlphaFold, but potentially how some of the intellectual property concerns that we've discussed are creeping in with that AlphaFold 3, or perhaps that's the space that's just evolving at the moment. So and we really shouldn't forget that it's here to stay. And those use cases, I think, really are going to be very powerful. Of course, on the negative side, we've heard that we do have to think about the errors that are generated by this technology, especially given the inherent biases, both with the data that's being used to train the models, as well as the people developing these tools and the biases that they may have in terms of the approaches being taken. Thinking about the environmental impact in terms of the carbon and water use for the machines that power the technology, and really, I think focusing on the unique value that AI can add and sort of filtering out the noise from that value. And of course, that value is going to be different depending on the use case that you're particularly looking at. But overall, I hope this has been an interesting and informative session this afternoon in terms of how artificial intelligence can be applied to global health, the pitfalls to avoid, the approaches to take to enjoy success. And maybe I'm sure Tamer was going to do this anyway, but that there was a question in the chat earlier for more details about the call for papers and that deadline on the 19th of July, if you wanted to submit anything to the journal. With that, Tamer, I think I'll hand back over to you to close us out. But just allow me a second to thank the panel enormously for your contributions this afternoon, and special thanks to Charlie for framing it up with that talk.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of you, Craig for chairing, and for Charlie, Rohit, Carleigh and Gita for taking part. It's such an exciting area. And with so many questions, still more questions coming than we have answers. We will try and make sure that we revisit discussions and debates like this one regularly over the course of the next few years as the field evolves. And I'm sure there'll be even more challenges to discuss. Thank you to everyone who's joined and watched this. It is recorded. We will circulate it after today. And just the final word really about the special collection. Thank you, Craig, for mentioning it. I've just put something in the chat which talks a bit more about our aims with this. It's testing the water. We know that there is a lot going on. We've talked a lot about some elements of it today with research and development and other parts of the process of the journey, from research to implementation and policy, but there are many others. We want to use the opportunity with this special collection to bring together some of the interesting research and learnings, implementation as well, to see if this is something that we can do more permanently. So do please consider the July 19th deadline. Of course, we are a global health tropical medicine society and charity. We're interested in how the application and use of AI can be made available to low middle income countries and can be equitable and beneficial. We've touched on that today, so I'm really pleased to continue that as we move forward. So that's all from me. Thank you so much again for joining. You can find out more about RSTMH on our website, and I'm sure DNDi too. And thank you all. See you soon.